In the last lecture, I set the terms for the week's discussion, those being retrenchment and political advancement. I wanted to make clear on Monday's lecture that the Scottsboro Boys and the Black Cabinet represent two ends of a spectrum of political possibilities of Black America in the 1930s. They are together articulating a new voice, a new vehicle to communicate responses to and articulations of possibilities, but they're coming from very different places in very different ways. The Scottsboro Boys reaches back to a past of social control, certainly, but also representing, in the Scottsboro Boys' case, in the way the Communist Party gets involved, that there's a new mentality at work in Black America and new values in, or being the accused being seen as commodities in the political battlefield. And the Black Cabinet represented the best possible world of new political insiderism at the national level, in a different way than the Scottsboro Boys, serving as important symbols of Blacks' centrality to the political realm. Now, I wanted to continue the discussion along those lines, and these are the themes for this week. I want to continue the discussion along these lines by focusing upon the National Negro Congress, the Marian Anderson Easter Sunday Concert, and the March on Washington movement. The events for this lecture are essentially the second half of the 1930s, but it's important to realize the things I was talking about in Monday's lecture are overlapping many of the events I'm talking about today. These are all happening in the course of the decade, but certainly at some point all happening at the same time. Let me start with the National Negro Congress. The National Negro Congress, for some reason, this is a lecture I wrote down a lot of notes for you guys. I'm not surely why. Maybe I was being generous. I don't know. Anyway, the National Negro Congress has its start in the National Industrial League. Forms in 1933. This is a response to the development of, Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, and agencies like the National in early incarnation, the National Industrial Recovery Act, and how this organization was not going to care about setting minimum wages for agricultural workers or for domestic workers. And two men get together, Robert C. Weaver and John P. Davis, and black men start testifying before Congress, before the Senate, saying, this is an abomination. You're completely writing out or disregarding those areas that have the most important or significant black involvement. The Negro Industrial League is a two-man operation, but they fashion themselves as an umbrella group representing black interests across the country. It exists pretty much only in passing. Now, the important part of it is that Robert C. Weaver is seen as doing such a great job, having recently received his JD from Harvard. He gets incorporated into the federal government and is one of the very first race advisors. So that's where the Negro Industrial League is important for bringing in one of its own into the federal bureaucracy. The other person, John P. Davis, remains an outsider. And we'll be spending more time at Davis's activities in the course of this lecture. Davis organizes, in the wake of the Negro Industrial League's collapse, the Joint Committee for National Recovery, lasts only for 2 years. It, too, fashions itself as an umbrella organization representing blacks' needs from across the country. Now, this is a self-representation. I mean, you do not have all sorts of black-run organizations running to John P. Davis and the Joint Committee for National Recovery, which is essentially him and an office and a couple of figurehead people. Davis, they aren't running to Davis because, one, this is new kid on the block, basically. They're still looking at organizations like, churches, business associations, the NAACP, for example. But the Joint Committee for National Recovery does at least one important thing before it collapses. And it organizes a conference at Howard University. And this is a conference that is dedicated to trying to understand the economic plight of African Americans during the Great Depression and the New Deal. Now, it's just a conference, but it's remarkable that it brings together people from a wide range of political backgrounds. It brings together labor organizers, agricultural workers, domestic workers, people who are doing work on the ground. It brings together intellectuals like W.E.B. Du Bois, who's becoming a Marxist and talking about economic cooperatives along race lines, something actually in some ways looking similar to Booker T. Washington's ideologies. It brings together leaders of the Communist Party, the Workers' Party, the Socialist Party. It brings together people from the federal government, like Robert C. Weaver now, all asking the question, what is the status of the Negro in the New Deal? And the result of this conference was, well, many things came out of it. One, scathing attack on the New Deal for the way it ignored blacks' conditions on the ground, in ways I outlined briefly on Monday. It launched an investigation into communistic activities at Howard University. Howard University then essentially being funded by the federal government, and essentially now still receiving most of its support from the federal government. An investigation was launched into the communist activities at Howard, and certainly there were communists on the faculty at Howard, and certainly socialists as well, and certainly a lot of sympathizers. So it was an attempt to silence and actually shut down the university as a result of this conference. And most importantly, it establishes a group called the National Negro Congress. Oh, I forgot that slide. Okay, those are the notes of what I just told you. The National Negro Congress actually does turn into that kind of umbrella organization that the Negro Industrial League and the Joint Committee for National Recovery all aspired to be. The National Negro Congress forms out of a call. I mean, the Howard University Conference, we need to organize a national political action group, and it becomes the National Negro Congress, formed in 1936. The Congress convenes for the first time in Chicago in 36, where it's met with police harassment due to alleged communist participation. A. Philip Randolph, who we'll be talking about more towards the end of the lecture, but for now, just to know the most important, bless you, the most important labor leader in black America is elected its first president. And the National Negro Congress establishes sorry, I'm all off my slides here today, excuse me. It establishes a slate that's concerning civil rights, women's rights, labor's rights, aid to farmers and sharecroppers. It calls for an anti-lynching law, calls for voting rights, educational opportunities, social and unemployment insurance, in opposition to war and fascism, civil rights, women's rights, labor's rights, aid to farmers and sharecroppers, anti-lynching law, voting rights, educational opportunities, social and unemployment insurance, and an oppression to war and fascism. If you think back to a few weeks earlier in the course, a large part of this slate that the National Negro Congress calls for is identical to the slate, to the manifesto that the Niagara Movement calls for some 30 years earlier, not quite 30 years. The point is a lot of the issues haven't changed, despite some real changes in those 31 years, excuse me. Now, the National Negro Congress was not just made up of black folks getting together calling for a slate of a progressive future. It is, as the slide up here indicates, a cross-section of black groups and white labor of all different kinds of groups, as far as black business bureaus, black churches, black labor organizations. The Congress actively courts white labor in this regard, especially the Congress of Industrial Organization. And it sets out this agenda for change on the ground. It has, more than anything else, a labor orientation, despite even business groups being involved. It's going to change things on the ground. And the person organizing, sort of, A. Philip Randolph is the president, but the person doing the work on the day-to-day basis is John P. Davis. He was there at the Negro Industrial League, there at the Joint Committee for National Recovery, and he's really running the National Negro Congress. And he runs it for the length of the NNC's existence, which is not quite a decade. Now, one of the first things that the Congress does successfully, aside from just meeting, is establish the Southern Negro Youth Congress, essentially the youth arm of the Congress. The Southern Negro Youth Congress had its inaugural conference half a year later, in February 1937, in Richmond, Virginia. And it makes its headquarters there for a number of years. With the guidance of the Southern Negro Youth Conference leaders, it becomes a permanent organization and almost immediately organizes 5,000 tobacco workers into the Tobacco Stemmers and Laborers Industrial Union. Very soon after, an SNYC leads a sit-down strike at a Virginia tobacco company and gets wage increases of 20 to 33%. This is remarkable. The Southern Negro Youth Congress, these are people your age and a little bit older, going down to Richmond, Virginia, the heart of the Confederacy, and organizing black workers into a union and getting wage increases for them. It's nothing really short of astonishing. By 1939, when the third annual conference of the SNYC gathers, they meet in Birmingham, Alabama. Over 600 delegates are in attendance. It's the largest conference to date. The themes of the conference revolved around citizenship, equal opportunity, and black culture. These are themes that by now must be familiar to all of you. I've been talking about it during this course, after all. Again, themes from the Niagara movement, but in this case with the students, a different type of cultural emphasis, I think a hangover in a sense from the Harlem Renaissance. But the Southern Negro Youth Congress was not another middle-class black venture. I'm thinking, too, that sort of the cultural producers in the Renaissance. It espoused a democratic socialist vision. It was militantly interracial. It offered its full support to the Congress of Industrial Organization, that breakaway set of labor unions that actually welcome black workers. And this is the most important part, it's very quietly communist. The Southern Negro Youth Congress moves its headquarters down from Richmond down to Birmingham and establishes a watchdog presence in the Deep South. It wages suffrage campaigns, trying to get people to vote, anti-poll tax campaigns. It tries to fight against police brutality. Now, the Southern Negro Youth Congress is important because of its communist involvement, certainly, but also because you can see it as a preface to the civil rights activities that defined Birmingham some 20 years later, and that, as we'll see next week, you start seeing a lot of these kinds of activities in other places throughout the South, through other organizations. And I'll expand upon this point later on. It's very important. Southern Negro Youth Congress is but one example that if you think about it, forces a reperiodization of the civil rights movement. Leave that alone there for a moment. Well, the SNYC begins to fade as we get into the 1940s. Its male leaders go off to fight. Its female leaders do not remain youthful. I mean, neither do the men, of course, but the women are still at home. It's no longer a youth congress. They're not regenerating themselves. And the whispering about its linkage to the Communist Party really prevents it from becoming a major political force. After the Soviet-Nazi pact in 1939, when Hitler and Stalin get together saying we won't fight against each other, which alienates a lot of people who are supporting the Communist Party in the United States. Meanwhile, back in the National Negro Congress, so roll back the clock a few years, Randolph, A. Philip Randolph, who's the president, is hearing more whispering about communist involvement in the National Negro Congress. He's not happy about it. He denies it at first. He goes, no, we are an independent organization, even though we've modeled ourselves after communist ideologies as far as developing a popular front of all people from different kinds of places coming together to fight towards this one goal. We are not communist. But then it becomes clear that communists have infiltrated the National Negro Congress, mainly through the Congress of Industrial Organization. So white labor organizers, Randolph concludes, are bringing communism into this organization, and he wants no part of it. Randolph, after denying it for a while, goes to the National Convention in 1940, where he's going to stand up in front of the Congress, the National Negro Congress, and resign with fire, talking about how the communists do not have our best interest at heart. He's basically booed off the stage. I mean, the communists had now taken control of the Negro Congress. And John P. Davis, where is he through all of this? Well, he's a communist, actually. And so, he's caught in rock and a hard place, but sides with the Congress, and that's where he continues to reside for a handful more years. And that's in 1940. And Randolph's about to go off and start something quite different in response to his departure from the National Negro Congress. And we'll get to that towards the end of the lecture.